Good evening, Praise Chapel Fresno, and all those of you tuning in with us this evening, we appreciate you tuning in. Wherever you're tuning in at, whatever you're tuning in on, we're just glad that you're here with us this evening. Don't forget, you can continue to support this ministry, this church, this move of God with your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts that you can give digitally. You can do that via EasyTithe in your smartphone app. You can also go to easytithe.com. Click the menu button, or easytithe.com, search Praise Chapel Fresno, and it'll take you to the appropriate site. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu button in the upper right-hand corner, go down to where you see Give. It's going to take you to a secondary website that you can give on. And of course, if you're joining us on our in-person services, we have our tithes, our offerings envelopes available behind every chair. Our support staff have multiple envelopes for people if you can't find one. And our tithes and offering box is located just outside the sanctuary. We're still trying to limit person-to-person contact, so it is located just outside the sanctuary. So right after service, or whenever you have it done, you can just drop it off right in there. We'll make sure it gets deposited in a timely manner. You can also mail in, drop off your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts here at the physical address of the building. If you don't know what that is, just go to Google and search Praise Chapel Fresno, California, and you'll see our address where you can mail in, drop off tithes and offerings. We are still live casting only on our Wednesday nights. Sundays are both in-person and live casted. Live casting is now just kind of like a way of life that we're going to be continuing to conduct ourselves in. But we have our in-person services Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock. Our Sunday school is open. Those doors open at 9:45. Parents, please be a bit more mindful about that. We get a lot of kids that are coming in that are excited to get into Sunday school. We got a line going that's great and everything like that, but we still want to try to maintain some manner of social distancing if we can't completely understood. But those doors open at 9:45 on the dot for us to get our kids into Sunday school so they can have their time of worship and a lesson that's just been put together. Hearing nothing but amazing things coming out of our Sunday school right now. So excited just to hear kids saying, I can't wait to go to Sunday school. Literally waking up in the morning on Sundays and saying, Mom and Dad, are we going to church? You know, that's exciting to hear that we put together a program that is being well received, well administrated, and we just appreciate everything that has been going on. However, here in our sanctuary, on Wednesdays, we've been kind of going through Bible studies, and these last couple of weeks, we've been going over our fast and going through scriptures on our fast, and it gave me this real big opportunity. I spent a lot of time in prayer. You know, God, where do you want to go with this next? Do we want to continue with the Bible study? Do we want to, do something else? Just asking for God to give us some hope. Can I get this turned up just a little bit in the house? I'm channel 4. I'm sorry, I'm yelling and I barely feel like I'm coming out. Test 1, 2. Our apologies. Thank you. That's good. So I was praying and just trying to figure out exactly where God wanted to take this. What did God want to do with our Wednesday nights, with going through? And I still felt like we needed to continue on with a type of Bible study. That I feel like there's a lot of important things that we're finding through that delves into faith, that delves into multiple different things, that I really feel like God is exposing a few things and really getting us back into a specific place where He wants to rebuild, or maybe He's just strengthening some belief systems and just overall making us a bit more knowledgeable about our faith, what we believe, why we believe it, so when we have to answer questions, we can do so with the knowledge that God has given us. But just being able to answer questions is one of the most important things that we can do as Christians when we're trying to spread the name of Jesus Christ, because people will often ask these questions. They'll often go around and say, well, what about this? What about that? Why do you believe this? Why do you believe that? And if we can't answer those questions, the first thing you do is you lose their faith, right? Because if you can't be believed in yourself, if they can't look through you and say, okay, you know what you're talking about, they have to believe in us first, and that we know what we're doing. We know that we're guiding them towards truth. So as I was going through this, I noticed that there's quite a few questions and quite a few different things that are going on in the Christian realm that have to deal with end times. And everyone is delving into this book of Revelation, not revelations, but revelation. And so as I was praying, that kept coming to mind. So I started jumping through that, tearing it apart. And I was just going to start it and just start, going off and talking about it. But the more that I went into it, we find out that Revelations is one of the most confusing books that you could read in the Bible. It's written differently. And so I felt if I had just jumped on top of this and just started going off on it, I feel like I would do more confusion. I would create more confusion about the book than others may think. And so I felt what we needed to do is we need to go through an introduction. We need to understand a few things about what the book of Revelation is, but also how we have to read it. And yeah, people would say, well, it's a Bible. You read a Bible, Pastor Will. You just read it and the words, and you read the words, and that's it. And that is true. But there's quite a bit that's going on in the book of Revelation that we need to understand how to interpret. We need to understand a few things that are going on. We also need to understand that there are different perspectives of what the book of Revelation says. So Revelation calls us to present faithfulness in the light of a far greater eternal reward. So the whole book is about us remaining faithful. It's calling for Christians to remain faithful even when it costs us. I'm not talking about financial costs. I'm talking about the costs of remaining in the faith, the costs of losing people that we might lose in this road, the cost of being made fun of, the cost of persecution that we've faced before. It also warns us that compromise with the world system may bring brief pleasure, but ultimately it entails eternal disaster. It encourages us to be a witness, not to compromise or cut corners out of the truth. Make it a bit easier for people to digest. And it warns us against this, that we have to preach the gospel as it is written. We should read Revelation because it brings a powerful call to integrity and a strong warning against compromise within the church. And in the books that we've been going through with the letters of Paul, we've read literally in every single letter that Paul writes, he's warning them against cultural changes. That we have to answer the culture, but we can't allow the culture to change the church. And that's kind of where Revelations comes from. It's saying that there is a culture the church has to respond to, but we have to remain we have to remain faithful, and the church needs to keep its integrity in the Word of God. There's no point of us just going around and preaching that people need to live a specific life if we're not going to preach truth. So the book of Revelation says, remain faithful, don't cut corners. It may be hard for people to digest, but ultimately it's God who's going to touch the heart. It's God who's going to bring the understanding in their mind. The Bible begins and ends in a garden temple. So Genesis begins in a garden temple. Revelation ends in a garden temple. But only in Revelation is the presence of evil forever banished. God placed Adam and Eve in a garden with a mandate to be fruitful, to multiply, and to extend the kingdom, his kingdom rule to the ends of the earth. They failed with original sin. Then God takes Israel and he gives them a mandate to be a light to the nations. They also fail. And then God sends Jesus Christ to die and be raised and seated at his right hand. And through Christ, the Great Commission comes, the first being, of course, Adam in the Garden of Eden. But Jesus Christ's second commission comes to push out the boundaries of the kingdom and to succeed where both Adam and Israel failed. The goal was always to spread the kingdom of God to all ends of the earth. That was always the goal. See, if Adam and Eve had remained fruitful and multiplied, they would have begun to grow outside their boundaries. Their family would begin to grow outside the boundaries that were set up. The kingdom would continue to spread throughout all eternity. But they failed. Israel was called to spread it through all the reaches of the world. They failed. So Jesus Christ comes back, second Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Who wrote it? Let's start throwing these slides up. Who wrote it? John. This is the son of Zebedee. So this is Mama Z, who she comes up when Jesus is coming through and she says, take my two sons, one on your left and one on your right. He considers Jesus his best friend. He followed him for 3 years and believed every word that Jesus ever said. He witnesses Jesus' miracles up close, like the walking on the water, the raising of the dead. And when Jesus was crucified, John never left his side. John was there. John was also boiled in oil and somehow still survived. He lives to be 100 years old or over 100 years old, and he's one of the very few apostles that will die peacefully, but he's known as the beloved disciple, and it says that Jesus loved him very much. The book of Revelation is written, and it was originally circulated throughout Asia Minor to the 7 churches in Asia Minor and gained early acceptance by these churches. So when John wrote it and disseminated it out to these churches, it was easily accepted. They grabbed it up and they started teaching it. And John is basically centered in Ephesus. He served and taught at Ephesus until he was banished to the island of Patmos. When you look at Asia Minor, there's a bunch of little islands that are off to its western coast, and he was banished to one of those by the emperor, or by the Roman persecution of Domitian. That's going to be in between the years of 94 to 95 AD, where he's given these great visions. It's God who gives it, it's Jesus Christ giving it through an angel talking to John, and he's given these great visions. John would then return to Ephesus in 96 AD, where he then writes the book. So he didn't write the book on the island. He writes the book when he returns to Ephesus. Now, John is going to endure 3 separate periods of persecution. So the very first one that John is going to endure is he's going to endure Emperor Nero and the oppression or the persecution that came with that. And that's going to go between the years 64 AD and 67 AD. Now, Nero was famous for blaming the Christians for setting fire to Rome, when that was basically Nero's plan to begin a whole new building program. The apostles, Peter and Paul, would also be martyred during this period. Then Paul, he goes through the Domitian persecution, which is from 95 AD to 96 AD. Now, this was shorter, but it was extremely vicious. 40,000 Christians will lose their lives in this year. And that's kind of, I mean, we're talking about just the Roman Empire. In this one area, 40,000 Christians in a year, their lives were ended. This is also the period where Paul gets banished to Patmos. Then the third persecution Paul will live through is the Trajan, and it's between the years 98 AD to 117 AD. And it's a period where the emperor focused on emperor worship. He wanted everyone just to worship him. He didn't want any other gods. He didn't want to fight through this. He didn't want to go through this. And this type of emperor worship would remain in place until Emperor Constantine comes, and that's in the 300s of AD, and then he converts over to Christianity and he makes it the nation's religion. So this type of the Trajan is basically, it ends at 117 because it's no longer about persecution, but that kind of mentality remains in place all the way until Emperor Constantine. Now, the book of Revelations is the only book in the Bible that is completely devoted to prophecy. So the importance here of understanding these three different periods of persecution that John would live through is he's seen the worst of the worst at these times, and when he writes this book, it's prophesying against certain things. It's prophesying in a time of persecution. It can be difficult to understand because it's written in a different literary style. Typically, literary styles that are written and spoken today, the first one is Shakespearean English. So that's the to be or not to be, to thine own self be true, now is the winter of our discontent. That's where there's an idea that's trying to be communicated, but it's not just brought about. It's basically wordplay around the idea. When you look at to be or not to be, it's yes or no. To this above all, to thine own self be true. Now is the winter of our discontent. Like things ain't going right. It's basically he tiptoes around an idea, and he allows those that are watching his plays, that are reading his books, or that are hearing him speak, kind of create their own idea of what he's talking about. If you're saying, Pastor Will, I've never read Shakespeare, you're not missing much. Then we look at modern English. Today, modern English would be the meh, woke, glamping, if that's still a thing. It's what is spoken about today, the vernacular that is used in the times that we find ourselves. Now, the book of Revelation is not written in either styles, obviously, but it's not even written in the modern English style or in his vernacular of his time. It's written in what's called apocalyptic literary style. So apocalyptic, it means that what is written foretells supernaturally inspired cataclysmic events that will transpire to the end of the world. It's not so much defined by the words being written than it is about the content being written about. The characteristics of apocalyptic style, there are 5 different characteristics of apocalyptic style. The first thing is that they're always produced in times of suffering. Now, Revelation is not the only apocalyptic style type book floating around. You can look at different writings that have come from different cultures that have their own end time predictions. Those would be written in that same type of literary style as long as it meets these criteria, where it's being written in a period of suffering. The second is it deals with intense despair about current events that you're suffering from, but then it also inspires intense hope of divine intervention for future events. So it's talking about how horrible things are in the time that it's written, but then it inspires hope for what is about to happen or what's down the road. The third thing is it's always going to be in symbolic language. It's always going to come from like dreams, from visions. It's never going to be a hard-written fact that they find. It's going to be someone's dream, someone's vision. It's going to have celestial characters in it. In ours, the celestial characters would be demons, angels, God, Satan, and they act to an ultimate purpose. So they're not just there to take part in the end of the world. There's an active participation from these celestial beings. And then towards the end of each one of these books that are written in this style, the wicked will be judged and the righteous will be saved. So those that went against whatever faith was being spoken or written about are judged, and those that held to it are saved. Now, we have to understand how to read apocalyptic literature. So just like you would read Shakespeare, not really understand it, and you have to gain, like, what is he talking about? Same thing with modern English today. Sometimes we're talking to people, they're using words and terms that we have no idea what they're talking about. And so sometimes we got to go to Urban Dictionary, we got to go to Wikipedia, what are they talking about? It's the same thing in apocalyptic literary style. We have to understand how to read it. This kind of literature pulls a veil aside and lets us see the meaning behind history. It doesn't just predict what will happen. It places a larger context on the relationship between, in the book of Revelations, it's between God and humanity. It's a greater explanation of that relationship that exists. Read a passage in any one of the 4 Gospels, and what do we typically do with that? We zero in on what Jesus Christ was saying. That's what those Gospels are written for, life and times of Jesus Christ. When you read the epistles for a combination of explanation and encouragement, but Revelation brings an entirely different category. So when we're reading and we're saying, well, this is what Jesus spoke in these times, we're going between all 4 of them. What did he say? We're getting a deeper understanding of Jesus through the Gospels. It's saying the book of Revelations also has its own type of style that we have to focus in on. There's something it's asking us to do. With all its beasts, its battles, its clues, the calamities that happen in it, how should we approach it? Now, if you were just to read it, it's got some pretty terrifying stuff in it. It's got some weird things that have happened that you might actually read and be like, hey, didn't they make a movie about this? And yeah, like Hollywood's basically all of their movies that have the end of the world, they're drawing something from the book of Revelation. Like it's always going to come from it. So this is how we have to read it. How should we approach it? Number 1 is you have to pay attention to symbolism. We have to understand that there's a lot of symbolism that's going to be spoken about. So when it begins to happen, we have to pay attention to what's being written. Because the symbolism is going to evoke emotions, and we need to pay specific attention to the emotions it evokes from us. So in the book, John will speak of a beast rising from the ocean, and it's evoking the emotion of fear. And that's what John is trying to convey across, is that there should be a sense of fear of what's coming at them. And so we have to pay attention to the emotions that we feel when it comes to the symbolism. Number 2, we can't forget the original audience it was written for. So this was written for the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Like the church of Ephesus, Laodicea, all of them, it's written for those 7 churches, and it was adopted. Take into consideration the time it was written and what was happening when it was written. So in the time that it's written, they're going through these persecutions. They just came out of Emperor Nero, who was known as the worst offender of Christians. He sought to do nothing but destroy Christianity. So they're coming from this period where they would see this person, they would see this Emperor Nero as demonic. They would see this Emperor Nero as working for nothing but Satan. Because they would be warned of these types of people that would come in there and persecute the church, and that they would be sent and they'd be emissaries of evil, not of God. The third thing, and this is one of the most important ones, do not overanalyze the symbols. The more you research into this, and that's why I wanted to do an introduction, because I started researching into things that John wrote about, and there are so many different interpretations of what people think it is, that it goes from like kind of, okay, that could be reasonable, to flat out just like, oh my God, that's heresy. How can you be preaching this in a church? But that's what's coming from it, is people have their own interpretation, so we cannot overanalyze the symbols. It's easy to get lost in the detail of each symbol, and while they'll have meaning, do not forget about the original context. So yeah, we're going to interpret what Paul is looking at. We're going to have to understand a few things, but we can't overanalyze it, and we can't forget the original audience he was writing these for. And it was for those 7 churches that were under persecution. And then number 4 is think about the writing purpose. Most apocalyptic literature is written to encourage people who were oppressed. It's not meant to terrify. It's not meant to push people. It's meant to encourage people who were oppressed, give them hope that a victory and better days were ahead. So Revelations is not a book of condemnation of saying all that do this. It's a book of saying, look, those of you that are oppressed, that are being persecuted, there are better days ahead. Because each one of these churches were facing these different types of persecution. They were going through these same 3 different types of persecution. And so John's writing this and saying, like, yes, we're going to be persecuted. Yes, it's probably going to get worse. But we have to stay true. We have to preach truth. We can't alter it. We can't water it down. We can't let the culture we're in alter the word of God. But we have to know that there are better days ahead. Now, the word revelation translates the Greek, the word apocalypsis, which means a disclosure or an unveiling. So revelations equals unveiling. They're revealing something to us. Revelation unveils an unseen spiritual war in which the church is constantly engaged in. The cosmic conflict between good and evil, God and his Christ on one hand, Satan and his evil allies on the other, both demonic and human. And this is what John is focusing on. He's going to focus on these allies. That, yeah, there are allies within the church that are sent by God, but that the enemy himself, Satan, has allies too, and he'll send them against the church. In this conflict, Jesus, who was the Lamb and already won a decisive victory through his sacrificial death, but his church continues to be assaulted by, and there are going to be 3 main things that are going to come through this. The church is going to be assaulted by the dragon. Now, this is persecution. And this persecution is the beast. That it'll be discussing. It's going to talk about this dragon, and it's going to bring about this beast. The second is it's going to talk about deceptive heresy. This is the false prophet. And remember, when we're going through the letters from Paul, he's constantly warning the churches against false prophets, that people will come in and they'll tickle your ear. They'll tell you what you think you want to hear, but it's not the truth. And they're going to pull you a little bit further away. And then the third most prominent character is going to be an allure of material affluence. This is the cultural approval or the prostitute. So these are the 3 that John really focuses in on throughout the books that he's going to go through. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of other things happening, but these are the 3 characters that Paul is going to refer to when it comes to the enemy and his allies. By revealing the spiritual realities behind the church's trials and temptations, and by affirming Christ's triumph in the new heaven and the earth, the visions of Revelation fortify believers to endure the suffering for what's to come. He's letting these churches know it's rough, it's going to get harder, it's going to get rough. Like, he was just banished and he's released because of the end of that persecution, the end of this emperor. He's allowed to come back, but he's telling them, look, this isn't the end. There's a lot more coming. When we get into the book, you'll start realizing that there are going to be 2 numbers, and it's called numerology. And first off, don't worry about that. But there are going to be 2 numbers that are going to be prominently identified in the book of Revelations. This is going to be the numbers 6 and 7. So when they look at the number 7, it symbolically, the number 7 stands for completeness. In Scripture, it often symbolizes completion of perfection. It symbolizes the unity of the 4 corners of the earth, north, east, west, and south, and the Trinity. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. It's complete. That God created the heavens and the earth, and he was meant to dwell over it. So it's talking about that unity. A distinct feature is the frequent use of the number 7 in this book. It's going to be used 52 times, if my count is correct. It's going to talk about this, the 7 Beatitudes, the 7 churches, the 7 spirits, the golden lampstand, stars, seals, horns in the 7 eyes, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, the signs, crowns, plagues, golden bulls, hills, and the 7 kings. Those are all going to be featured inside the book of Revelation. Now, the number 6, it's going to come across as 666, but number 6 means it's basically meant as an insult. So it's saying this is not complete. You're not the real thing, or you're short of being the real thing. And a lot of this, when you start pulling this apart, people have taken the number 666 and they've broken it down, and in Greek, it spells out Nero. And so people are saying, well, that's who John's talking about. That's what John's doing. And it says, the number of man is, and it gives this. So they're saying, we think John is talking about the Emperor Nero, but it's not there. But basically what they're trying to say when it comes to this is people will stand in a position of authority and act as if they have ultimate rule, but they are not God. That yes, Satan may gain some kind of ground over the earth, but that he is still incomplete, and he still answers to the one who is perfect and who has drawn perfection. 666 will be ascribed to the number of the beast, and it's noted just as an insult. Now, we have to talk about interpretations. Basically, there are 4 different types of interpretations that people read when it comes to the book of Revelation. Number 1 is there's a preterite. This means they think everything has been fulfilled. When they're reading it, they're saying this was for the first century church. Everything Paul was talking about, everything that was supposed to happen in the book of Revelation had happened within that century. Then second, you have the historical type of interpretation. This means that what Paul is speaking about, John is writing about, it's still in process. Some things may have happened, some things may yet to have happened, and some things are going to happen. That's kind of where a lot of Christianity falls. So they fall in this place. They say, well, there are some things that could have already happened, there's some things that are waiting to happen, and there's some things that will happen. Then you have the futurist. This would be someone saying everything Paul is talking about, nothing has happened from that, and it's waiting to be fulfilled. Most futurists that will interpret and write, they'll write that things will happen on Christ's return. It'll all happen in a very short period of time. But that's the futurist. They're saying everything in the book of Revelations has yet to happen. Then you have the spiritual interpretation. And that describes the symbols and spiritual realities and struggles. They believe that there is no literal application to what Paul is writing about. So they're saying all of this is in the spiritual realm. All of this is not, there's no literal application to what John is writing. Excuse me, I keep saying Paul. There's no literal application to what John is writing about. They just believe he's describing a spiritual conflict, that he's revealing to the churches the war that is going on in the spiritual realm. But what we need to know is the fundamental truths of Revelations do not depend on adopting a particular point of view or interpretation. As we're going to study this book of Revelations, for our lives and our way of thinking should be affected. So as we read through and as we gain an understanding, it should affect the way we think. It should affect the way that we live. Because knowledge is useless unless it's absorbed or adopted into our lives and our values. And I think at this point in time, it's a great book that we're going to go through. It's going to get really heavy into symbolism, and we're going to try to take just a literal look at it, give what some think, what others don't. Because again, God speaks to individuals through His living word. Now, there are some things that are flat out wrong that people are preaching or that people are talking about. Those I'll warn against, or I'll say, we'll talk about those as they come through. But the hope is that we're going to go through this book to gain a better understanding of what we should be doing with our lives at this time. The focus shouldn't be the end time, like, oh, well, we have an end time approaching, so we have to do this, this, and this. It should be, if I live my life for Christ today, I shouldn't have to worry about these. I'm going to face persecution, but it's because I know if I endure and I remain faithful to the truth, that there are better days ahead, that God plans to build me a future that is built in hope, that is meant to prosper and not to hinder. So we're going to go through this on Wednesdays. It's going to get super intense. Again, we're going to remind you, if there are questions, post them on the videos that you see, whether it be on Facebook or YouTube. and we'll answer them as best we can before we go on to another section of the book. So we appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. It's an introduction to the book of Revelations. Don't forget, you can continue to support this ministry via your tithes or offerings. You can do that digitally on the Easy Tithe app on your smartphone. You can also go to easytithe.com, search Praise Chapel Fresno. You'll see where you can give at. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the menu button in the upper right-hand corner. Go down to where you see Give. It'll take you to a third-party website we're contracted with. You can also give in person. If you're joining us on our in-person services Sundays at 10 o'clock, we have envelopes in front of every chair. So you can give your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts here. Our tithes and offerings box is just outside the sanctuary, safe, secure. You can drop it off on your way out. Just still trying to maintain social distancing, minimizing person-to-person contact. And if you're mailing in or dropping off tithes, offerings, you can do so. If you don't know the address to our campus, just Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California. You'll see our address to where you can mail in or drive up and drop off your tithes or offerings. We'll make sure it gets deposited in a timely manner. But we thank you guys for joining tonight. We love you, and we'll see you Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, whether in person or live casted.